tell you a little bit about Eric, I think he's a young man who's going to go a long way. I've been very impressed with his ambition and his insights, and I'm very pleased that he's elected to do his PhD study about the Meskwaki. The reason I say that is because we have been working with the tribe as they've been opening up their brand new cultural center and museum. And I've gone over there myself to work, but I've often brought University of Iowa students in the Museum Studies program or the History Department to go with me. So I can vouch for Eric. He's the person who rearranged all the shelving and furniture that's in the conservation lab over there. He climbed up on the tall ladders, which have to be about 12 feet high, in order to help paint their ceiling a dark color so the track lighting would work well. And so he's really rolled up his sleeves and pitched in ways that I think are very important, both for him in terms of making contacts with the tribe, but just helping to get this big project underway. So Eric is a doctoral student at the University of Iowa, but he's a South Dakota native, and he's had experience interacting with the First Nations people in that state. He spent some time working as tribal liaison in the office of U.S. Senator Tim Johnson in western South Dakota, and he's really become an expert on the Constitution the Meskwaki created in 1937. So this story he's telling today about the CCC workers is part of his investigation of what federal government relations were like with the tribe, what economic situations were like during the Great Depression at the time that Constitution was created, and how some of that history might shape future decisions. So if you'll help me in welcoming Eric, we're very pleased he's here today. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, of course, for being here. I want to, of course, thank the State Historical Society for hosting us all this afternoon, especially Mary for the nice introduction, but also for all the support that she and the whole staff at the State Historical Society have been willing to give me in my research over the last couple semesters since I moved to Iowa to pursue this project, but also to Jonathan Buffalo and Suzanne Wanatee, especially to Meskwaki tribal members. Jonathan's actually the director of the historical department in the museum out at the settlement, and unfortunately they couldn't be here with us today. But I do also want to thank you folks who came up from the settlement to see the talk. This is by far the furthest anyone except my mom has ever traveled to see me talk, so I certainly appreciate that. But no, seriously, the project and the research that we'll talk about today, it's about the Meskwaki people, and it's about their efforts to affirm and defend their tribal sovereignty since they reestablished their community here in Iowa 150 years ago. And without the persistence and tenacity of Meskwaki generations past and present, there wouldn't be a story for me to tell here today, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to do the research, to work on it, to write it, but also to share it with you folks today. So. I also want to mention that I welcome, of course, when I get done with the talk, it's scheduled for about 45 minutes or so, but I do welcome questions, comments, critiques, anything that anybody has, and I'd love to hear that, as I said, afterwards, and we'll make sure we remind everybody to use the microphone so they can get it recorded for the TV. But I do actually have a class to teach at 1:30 in the afternoon, so as much as I'd like to linger around and sort of chat with people, I won't be able to do that for very long, unfortunately, but I did leave my contact information, my email address with Mary in case anybody wants to get a hold of me with further questions or anything like that. I'd be happy to help. So without further ado, we will move directly into the talk. And just in case anybody here isn't familiar, I just want to introduce some basic information about the Meskwaki Nation. Forgive me for speeding through a very, very broad and very complicated history, but just consider this, a quick catch-up for anybody who isn't unfamiliar with the Meskwaki past. Today, the Meskwaki Nation, which is officially recognized as the Sac and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa, owns an 8,000-acre settlement here in central Iowa, just outside of Tama. And oral histories actually suggest that the tribe originated somewhere near present-day Maine. But over the centuries, the arrival of European colonists slowly pushed indigenous peoples across the U.S., what's now the U.S., further and further west. By the 17th century, the Meskwaki were located around what is today Michigan. By the late 17th century, they'd been pushed into Wisconsin. And by about 1750, the tribe inhabited the banks of the Mississippi River over here on the Iowa side. They and their close ally, the Sauk, lost much of their land during the Black Hawk War of 1832, as a lot of people are familiar with, and after that conflict ended, the federal government forced most Meskwaki to the Indian Territory, as it was called, in present-day Kansas, sometime in the 1840s. And dissatisfied with the land and the conditions in Kansas, tribal members negotiated with the Iowa State Legislature for the ability to purchase a land base upon which they could rebuild their community in the 1850s. And it was actually in 1857 that the tribe arranged for the state governor of Iowa to purchase their original 80-acre parcel of land with Meskwaki money and to hold it in trust for the tribe in perpetuity. The settlement, and this is very important as some people know, the settlement is actually not a reservation as most tribal lands are called because it was never assigned by the federal government. Instead, it was independently selected by tribal members. The land has remained, the land actually remained in that trust with the state of Iowa for 4 decades as the tribe subsisted and used treaty annuities to purchase additional land and grow their settlement. And the settlement is a salient element of tribal economy and political culture. In the 1930s, tribal lands were the physical space from which tribal members hunted, farmed, and subsisted. But these lands also provided a buffer between the Meskwaki and the non-Meskwaki worlds. By 1900, however, the settlement's legal status had shifted dramatically from the relatively autonomous state tribal trust status that tribal members had previously enjoyed. Bowing to pressure by assimilationist whites, the Iowa State Legislature transferred jurisdiction over the tribe and its lands to the federal government in 1896. And after that, the Meskwaki quickly found themselves in a position shared by almost every other American Indian community during this period, in an unequal trust with, and thus highly subordinate to, an overzealous Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, the federal agency that was charged with federal Indian policy, administering federal Indian policy since the early 19th century. And over the next several decades, the tribe struggled to regain the political authority that they lost and to maintain control over their local affairs. So this is where my own research comes into play. As Mary mentioned, I'm currently in the early stages of writing my dissertation on Meskwaki politics and governance. It's focused specifically on delineating the ways in which Meskwaki tribal members have worked within the American political system by negotiating with the state of Iowa, as well as local Iowans and federal administrators, to protect and to defend their sovereignty since 1857. My master's work here at Iowa was also based on this idea, and it examined the development of the Meskwaki tribal constitution in 1937. As you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, a 4-member constitutional committee actually wrote the constitution that tribal members ratified in a narrow 2-vote election in November of 1937. And on the right, I have a picture of John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he's actually widely credited by historians for sort of being in charge of shifting Indian affairs, federal Indian policy, away from the extremely destructive policies of assimilation and allotment and towards a resurgence of tribal sovereignty. The Indian New Deal, as his package of policies was called, also entailed a number of relief programs aimed at helping Native communities overcome the ravages of the Great Depression. That's what we'll be talking about more here in a little bit. But the concept of tribal sovereignty plays a central role in my research. And one of my aims with the dissertation will actually be to show the ways in which members of the Meskwaki Nation have throughout history engaged their sovereignty in significant ways, endeavoring all along to defend their control over local affairs. And tribal sovereignty itself is among the most hotly debated subjects of Native American studies today. Essentially, it refers to the rights of American Indian communities to control their political, economic, and cultural lives as sovereign nations that exist outside the control of the United States government. As many of you are probably aware, tribal sovereignty, even though that phrase is itself a relatively recent construction, predates the arrival of Europeans in North America and certainly the formation of the United States. European and American nations recognized, understood, and affirmed tribal sovereignty through treaties and other nation-to-nation agreements over the course of several centuries. But in the early 19th century, as the U.S. grew powerful and its demand for cultural and geographical dominance grew, the federal government used various means to subvert and limit the tribal sovereignty of American Indian nations across the continent. And getting into the details of this broader story of Native American history, of course, lies outside the scope of what we can talk about here today. But it should suffice to say that American Indian tribes currently inhabit a sovereign space somewhere in between the jurisdictions and powers of the state and federal governments that surround them. This is why Native tribes like the Meskwaki have their own governments, courts, and business ventures like casinos, which exist outside the parameters of state law. And because tribal sovereignty is such a complex issue, and because it holds such significant ramifications for Native peoples today, historians, social scientists, legal scholars, and policymakers all contribute to lively discourses on its meaning and applicability to Native American communities today. Accordingly, my project intervenes in important scholarly debates about the meanings of tribal sovereignty and its historical characteristics. Some scholars have noted the prevalence of tribal calls for sovereignty since the Red Power era of the 1960s and 1970s, people might be familiar with. Other scholars have been more critical of the concept of sovereignty itself, calling it a fundamentally European idea that has no legitimate ties to indigenous ways of governing. And my dissertation, hopefully, will provide the first comprehensive analysis of modern Meskwaki history, but will also contribute an important new perspective on understudied issues like the relationship between land ownership and tribal sovereignty, and it offers a reference that scholars in Native nations might find useful as they develop new strategies for self-determination. But you might be wondering, how does tribal politics or sovereignty relate to environmental history, or to the title of my talk, which is The Landscape of Meskwaki History? And the answer to that question is twofold. First, it became apparent to me during my master's research that the unique land ownership of their settlement was fundamental to the Meskwaki Nation's abilities to reject federal incursions into their affairs for several decades. And second, bits of evidence like this one popped up throughout my research. I'll give you a second to read it over there. This tract of land upon which my tribe dwells, John Tataposh wrote to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938, is communally owned by the Meskwaki Indians, purchased with their ancestors' own money. Therefore, we have the right to, through the right of ownership, decide how our affairs should be handled. And in this letter, Tataposh, who is a member of the Meskwaki Nation, was I should say, reveals the close link between his people's land and their vision of tribal sovereignty. All of a sudden then, my project about politics, sovereignty, and governance became about Meskwaki land and environment as much as it was about governance. Because in many ways, I think, the two are intimately intertwined. And on this next slide, we can actually see the tension between Meskwaki land and their relationship to their property. On the left, we have a color-coded map of the Meskwaki settlement as it grew over the years. The little green dot in the very center, I don't know if you can see it all that well, but the little green dot in the center is actually the original 80-acre parcel that the tribe bought in 1857. The rest of the colors show their land base as it has grown over the years. It seems that, as time went on and as the tribal population grew, Meskwaki leaders began to understand the utility of owning land as a way to insulate them from the oppressive federal policies, and they decided to expand their land and in turn their ability to reject incursions into tribal affairs. One historian has actually remarked that after 1867, tribal leaders had an almost fanatic desire to purchase land as opportunities arose, and the settlement grew to over 3,000 acres by 1915. Today, as I mentioned, it's almost 8,000 acres. And just so you can sort of relate it to the colors that are up on the slide here, the purple in the center there is basically how big the settlement was up until the mid-1930s, and then the orange or gold that expands out on the sides is how it's grown today, largely as a result of the casino that was built in the early 1900s, or excuse me, in the 1990s. But on the right side of the screen, we also see a quote from an oral history that was performed with Jonathan Buffalo about the tribe's homeland. As he notes, Iowa is not the original homeland or the creation place of the Meskwaki people. It's a transitory place to which they were pushed over the centuries and chose to inhabit while they wait to eventually, as Buffalo says, go home. So this issue, this central question about Meskwaki land and the remaking of their homeland, becomes an important question in my broader efforts to understand Meskwaki sovereignty. It's led me to think more broadly about how people consider the relationship between Native Americans and their environments today. So, the images on this slide show two of the most prolific stereotypes of the ways that people think about American Indian peoples and their relationship to the environment. I do think they're, a little bit ridiculous, but at the same time, I hope that nobody thinks I'm offering these pictures too flippantly. On the left side, we have Iron Eyes Cody from his famous 1969 ad campaign on the behalf of environmental activists, in which a man who looks like an Indian should look, at least according to Hollywood at the time and arguably today, cries at the sight of pollution as though he physically feels the pain of the land around him. On the right-hand side, we have Disney's Pocahontas, of course famous for holding conversations with various woodland creatures, not to mention her mentor, the tree named Grandmother Willow. And of course, there are many native peoples who view humans, animals, and the earth as intimately interconnected. In many cultures, it's customary to give thanks to game after it's been killed during a hunt, or to give offerings to the environment as a thanks for the bounties that it shares. But I think that we can all agree that those practices are a far cry from either Iron Eyes Cody's or Pocahontas' supposed connections to their environments. So then, in order to start investigating the role land and environment play in Meskwaki political history, I've turned to the scholarship of those who have asked questions to this, similar to the ones that I'm asking with my dissertation. And as I've mentioned, many American Indians relate land and environment closely with their communities and cultures. But scholars have long debated the precise nature of those relationships. Many see Indians and environments as inextricably linked, yet interpretations of this history have varied across a very wide spectrum. On one hand, for example, as we have here, noted indigenous activist Winona LaDuke asserts that American Indian communities are nations of people with distinct land areas, and our leadership and direction emerge from the land up. Our commitment and tenacity spring from our deep connection to the land. This relationship to land and water is continuously reaffirmed through prayer, deed, and our way of being. But other scholars have been more skeptical of Native ties to their environments, perhaps most notably, and certainly on the opposite end of this spectrum, and quite controversially in fact, anthropologist Shepard Krech III argues that stereotypes of Indian peoples as environmentally friendly, careful, and thoughtful, quote, ecological Indians are rooted in colonial tropes about the supposed nobility of indigenous peoples. And those tropes for him assume two forms. One of Indians in nature who understand the systemic consequences of their actions and feel deep sympathy with all living forms, and another of those who take steps to conserve so that Earth's harmonies are never imbalanced. But somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, historian William Cronon has argued that human beings reshape the Earth as they live on it, but as they reshape it, the new form of the Earth has an influence on the way that those people can live. The two reshape each other. This is as true as Indians as it was of European settlers. So we have these various perspectives on the relationship between native peoples and their environments. But how, you might be wondering, do these debates connect to Meskwaki politics or to tribal sovereignty? So let me bring up that same quote that I showed a little bit ago from the letter that John Tataposh sent to Franklin Roosevelt in 1938. What we see here in its fuller context is that Tataposh was invoking the Meskwaki settlement and his vision of tribal sovereignty in the context of the broader policy shifts brought on by the so-called Indian New Deal. During the Indian New Deal, which again, as I mentioned, was a series of programs and policy changes intended to improve native self-governance and equip tribes to escape poverty, intense debates over the meanings and form of Meskwaki governance dominated tribal politics. When the BIA presented the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, Meskwaki tribal members struggled to determine whether their best chance for stronger tribal sovereignty lay within their customary chief council system or with a new order undergirded by a written constitution. In 1937, as I mentioned, the tribe ratified its constitution and in a close and hotly contested election created the elected council that still governs the tribe today, which uses a system of written bylaws. And Tataposh was among those tribal members who wanted to reject the IRA, claiming that their land ownership and control over the settlement meant the law could not apply to them. In this way, then, we see members of the Meskwaki Nation using their physical environment to strengthen their position vis-a-vis the federal government. After all, as anthropologist Jessica Catalino has argued, sovereignty takes material form and is built with material resources. But the long-term impact of the tense IRA period has been closely analyzed by historians who have looked at various tribal communities across the United States and tried to understand what was going on politically. But for the Meskwaki, I would argue that the Great Depression demanded even more immediate attention and that its impact was somewhat paradoxical. On one hand, Meskwaki families continued to subsist as they had for generations, satisfying basic needs by hunting and farming, and in this sense, even before the Great Depression, tribal members might have been poor by white standards, but experienced no actual destitution. But on the other hand, the Depression wiped out the local cash economy, as the quote here suggests, and it stripped opportunities to hold jobs as farmhands or day laborers in surrounding communities. Meskwaki families ultimately lost what little cash they previously had, and the shock of the Depression inflicted further damage on the tribe's most vulnerable members. And as you can see here, as I mentioned, when the local economy took a hit, tribal members lost these opportunities to work as day laborers, and even with money that would be available through the federal relief programs, the average Meskwaki family only made about 1/4 of that earned by a white Iowa farm family during the same years. Nevertheless, tribal members responded in a number of ways. First, there were the various federal depression relief programs like the Works Progress Administration, which put American citizens across the nation to work doing everything from manual labor to transcribing oral histories or painting murals in post offices and public buildings across the United States. But there was also the Indian Relief and Rehabilitation Loan Program, which gave federal loans to American Indian families like the Meskwakis Frank Eagle and George Buffalo, both of whom received some federal funding and loans to repair their homes in 1937 as one example. And also the federal program Old Age Assistance, which provided cash payments to the elderly, benefited 6 Meskwaki tribal members through the Depression. But there were also many non-governmentally funded efforts, like the Meskwaki manufacture of maple syrup made from settlement trees, which tribal members collected, boiled down, and traded to regional tribes for a variety of foods and other goods. Namely, Meskwakis traded maple syrup regularly with members of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe communities in Wisconsin. And as you can see up on the slide here, unfortunately I don't know the name or identity of the individuals shown, but basically the slides, pictures that were shared by Suzanne Wanatee show a Meskwaki gentleman who has tapped trees down by the Iowa River that runs through the middle of the settlement. He's taking the sap from them, and then they built wiki-ups out in the woods where they would have these fires and boil it down. And interestingly enough, even though there was some demand, some of the newspaper articles I found that suggest this, there was some demand by local whites to actually buy the maple syrup from the tribal members, but they didn't want to sell it. They only used it for trading with other tribes for both for some cultural goods, but also subsistence goods. So, but of all these interesting and innovative responses to the Great Depression, I think the most significant was the Meskwaki participation in the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division, or the CCC-ID, which I'll discuss for the remainder of our time today. Because the CCC-ID arguably had the most significant impact on the economy and landscape of the Meskwaki Nation, and as we'll see, also on some of their efforts to improve their tribal sovereignty. So what was the CCC itself? The Roosevelt administration, as part of the New Deal, launched the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, in 1933 as a work relief program designed to both curb unemployment by giving young American men jobs that would improve their infrastructure, as well as improving the natural resources across the United States. At the same time, however, the CCC was designed to improve the men themselves. By conducting manual labor in military-like camps, CCC enrollees, it was thought, would learn how to become productive citizens and family men. Indeed, historian Margot Canaday recently released a book called The Straight State, in which she argues that the CCC focused specifically on administering workers under a strict moral code that would shape them into an idealized American breadwinner as the head of heteronormative family wage-earning units. And the image on the right, which is actually an advertisement for the Illinois CCC, offers the image of a hardy, burly, and smiling young man while billing the program as you can see here, a young man's opportunity for work, play, study, and health. And as you can see on the left, CCC camps, and they literally were camps, as I mentioned, which enrollees lived at and worked out of throughout the Depression, dotted the entire country, but they were especially concentrated in and around the Midwest, the South, and rural Appalachia. And the government established separate camps for whites, African Americans, and as we'll see, Native American enrollees. And overall, CCC programs employed over 2.5 million men during the program's tenure, which ran from 1933 all the way up until 1942 as the United States ultimately ramps up to participate in World War II. And the average CCC employee nationally earned about $30 per day, even though roughly 60% of that money was placed in a special account and sent along to the enrollees' families. This was part of that larger project of making sure that they didn't earn this money and then spend it on, drinking or gambling or some other vice that the government didn't agree with. It was intended to go in a particular account that would be used for the families to be able to buy food and get by through the Depression. But here in Iowa, there were actually 36 CCC camps, not including the Meskwaki division. In the official history, the Meskwaki CCC camps not counted among the ones in Iowa because they were separate administrative programs. There was no African American camp here in Iowa that I've found in the records, at least so far. And much of the work completed by these Iowa CCC workers can actually still be seen today with only an afternoon drive up to Lake McBride or Palisades Kepler State Park, which are very close to Iowa City. You can just head up the highway there. And some of the picnic shelters and different stone structures that were built, as well as dams and some roads and things, were actually built by the CCC during the Depression. But as I mentioned a little bit ago, the federal government created a separate Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division, or CCC-ID, for Native Americans. And I took the image on the right that you can see up here on the right from the monthly CCC-ID newsletter, which was called Indians at Work. It documented the operations of Indian Division programs nationwide from 1933 all the way until it closed in 1942. And I selected this issue from a volume later on in the CCC-ID years because the cover image of 3 Native men, who I don't believe are Meskwaki, from some other tribal community, but I picked it because they appear to be participating in training or drills as the United States ramped up for its participation in World War II in the early 1940s. And this image takes the same tone as the CCC poster that I showed a few minutes ago. Very much like the regular CCC, Indian Division administrators believed that the program could use manual labor and discipline in these things to teach Indian men how to behave as well-trained, productive citizens. This is all part of this broader sort of federal program to try to condition people to fit a very distinctive model of how they should be behaving. And also, if anybody is interested, you can just visit the Smithsonian Institution's online archive, where you can actually flip through scanned digital copies of all of the Indians at Work issues and read them for yourself. It's very interesting and really very easy to find just through Google. But back to my story. In 1933, the Indian Division started off with a national enrollment drive budgeted for some 15,000 tribal members across the country. Of all the CCC-ID programs launched in that first year, the Meskwaki Division was actually the smallest and only had room for 20 initial hires. The state with the highest budget for CCC-ID work was Arizona, that had openings for over 5,500 employees. And by 1942, when the CCC was canceled due to the United States' involvement in World War II, over 77,000 American Indians served in CCC operations nationwide. The number of dependents and community members that their work benefited is estimated to be somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. But on the settlement, the CCC-ID employed, on average, about 60 men per year. When working full-time, they received $30 a month, which was the same amount paid to the enrollees in the regular Civilian Conservation Corps. By 1942, a total of 112 tribal members had ever worked for the CCC-ID. Also, unlike the regular CCC and even some other CCC-ID camps, the Meskwaki did not leave their families to go live in separate camps. Instead, because of the size of the settlement, tribal members remained at home with their families, met at a designated spot each morning, and where they received their daily work assignment, and then would get on a bus and head out and go do whatever the daily assignment, the work was. And as I mentioned on an earlier slide, historians have tended to focus only on the economic impact of CCC-ID programs. I'm more interested, however, in the physical environmental changes that tribal members made to their property, as well as the ways in which those changes helped communities like the Meskwaki Nation navigate the tumultuous waters of the Indian New Deal, and even to survive some of that conditioning that the federal administrators was hoping would happen by forcing these people to behave in certain ways. But first, we'll talk about the environmental impact. When work started in July 1933, the Meskwaki settlement encompassed over 3,000 acres, and a wide variety of projects altered that landscape over the course of the decade. The map on this slide that I have up here offers a digitized image of the settlement's size around 1934. So if you remember that earlier slide that I had, this is the purple section that was in the middle, but I've also reoriented this so you can see it in comparison to Toledo and Tama, which are over on the right-hand side there, so that you can get a sense for the size of the community in relation to the ones that are around it. And one of the maps that illustrates the locations of CCC-ID developments, which I'll show in just a minute, reveals that by early 1935, merely 2 years into the program, over 70 projects had been completed on the settlement, and another map shows nearly 90 new tasks planned for the remainder of the 1935 work season. Projects included tending some 565 acres of hardwood forest, and this produced over 8 million board feet of lumber and cordwood for the tribe to use on its own, but also to sell to local communities. And enrollees also planted over 116 acres of pine, black ash, and miscellaneous hardwood trees during the program's 10 years. This amounted to over 28,000 saplings that they planted by hand in 1939 alone. And this planting contributed to dozens of erosion control projects that were designed to prevent the Iowa River, which runs through the middle of the settlement, from flooding farmlands or encroaching upon residential areas. Tribal members also built various wells, springs, and drainage ditches. And as you can see in this photograph, which I took myself last fall on the settlement, a couple of the pine stands that were planted by CCC workers are still standing on the settlement today. But Meskwaki workers also enhanced the settlement's built environment, not just the natural one. The image here shows a stone well house that accompanied a residential park built on the settlement in 1941 that's next to the stone house, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later on. And workers also laid telephone lines, built a central road, repaired fences, landscaped around BIA offices and tribal schools, and improved tribally owned recreational and powwow grounds, as well as an on-settlement baseball diamond that they built. And indeed, these workers altered virtually every corner of the settlement environment during the CCC-ID years. Generally, when I speak to tribal members, even Jonathan and others, when you ask about the CCC work, they usually say, well, there was the stone house and those 2 stands of trees that everybody can see from the road, but those tend to be the only ones that people remember. But as these next maps show, and this is what I was referencing a few minutes ago, the CCC-ID work was very, very widespread, and I don't know if people can see this all that well on the slide up here. It's a little bit difficult to see, and my next slide shows it a little bit better. But someone actually drew little green circles with a pencil on this settlement map in 1935, and this map shows the completed projects as of the middle of the summer of that year, 1935, and each of these little circles has a tiny code inside them. I found these maps in the National Archives Center in Chicago, and there's a little tiny code that I think corresponds to what type of work was going on. And I'm still trying to find to see if there's a key that'll sort of explain what's going on, so that I can make a map that'll actually show on the settlement what types of projects took place in what areas and at what times. But it's clear from this image, if nothing else, that CCC-ID work on the settlement was probably far more prolific than people recognize today. The second map, which you can see it because it's red a little bit better, but just in case anybody can't, I'll use the laser. Charles would be excited. He wanted me to use the laser. You can see these little red dots all the way up along all these spots here. And what it reveals is that basically you get a better sense of the sheer volume of the projects that altered the settlement landscape during the CCC-ID years. Overall, these show that the tribe improved virtually every square inch of the settlement, and in just this year alone, just to reiterate, there were 160 projects that were either completed that summer or planned to be completed by the end of the year. But aside from improving their shared property, members of the Meskwaki Nation used the CCC-ID to test the promises of a return to self-governance embedded in the Indian New Deal. One historian, Roger Bromaire, has tempered claims that the Indian Division itself offered opportunities for enhanced tribal authority. He argues that while tribal leaders had the authority to help select projects and were given virtually independent action on the reservations, the Indian program had to meet most of the regular CCC regulations, and when disagreements arose, that the white CCC rules prevailed. And on the Meskwaki settlement, this was sometimes the case. Twice, BIA administrators held badly needed relief work hostage when tribal members behaved in ways that administrators deemed inappropriate. In 1934, 9 workers were temporarily laid off for drinking alcohol, and administrators briefly suspended the entire program in the spring of 1935 when a few men quarreled with a program supervisor. But the Meskwaki Tribal Council held sway over many aspects of their land use, as well as various CCC-ID decisions. The council selected project locations, and it also improved program plans. Before the ratification of their tribal council in 1937, a small group of elders had appointed themselves to be an acting tribal council. And this body exerted influence over the CCC-ID program, for example, by delaying several projects in 1935 as they discussed the best locations for timber planting. The constitutionally backed council that was put in place after 1937 continued this practice and set about evaluating and directing CCC-ID work. In September of 1938, the council requested surveys of various tracts of land so that they could determine which sections to lease to outsiders and which to improve with available Indian Division labor. And if you're wondering, this practice of leasing settlement land to local farmers was one that the tribe had been doing since the late 1900s. They would raise revenue so that they could pay their property taxes and buy new land, right? So again, the land's important as the tribe's, working politically and being very savvy about the ways that they engage these processes. In 1941, they actually selected the location for the roadside park that I mentioned a bit ago, and they built the stone house along Highway 30, which was originally intended as a site from which tribal members could sell crafts to passing tourists. The council organized an agreement with the U.S. government for the building's construction and negotiated with the tribal member to use his portion of the settlement for the project. So again, they're really flexing those nation-to-nation muscles within the CCC-ID programs here. And the body also annually reviewed and agreed to all of the CCC-ID work and was grateful for the opportunities that it offered. In an official statement from the Tribal Council in 1941, the council president expressed the tribe's most sincere appreciation to the BIA and the CCC for the training and education in forestry, conservation, and construction, as well as the many improvements made possible on our tribal property. But Meskwaki need for and appreciation of CCC-ID employment did not preclude the workers from expressing dissatisfaction when it arose. As I noted earlier, it was a standard CCC practice to save large percentages of workers' wages at each monthly pay period, providing only partial payment up front and saving the rest for distribution to the employees' families. But on the settlement, program administrators paid Meskwaki workers only 60% of their wages and placed the remaining 40% to his credit for future use. But tribal members disagreed with this policy, and in late 1933, they agitated to receive their full monthly installment. And in and of itself, this example shows that tribal members had the power to push the BIA into altering its policies to meet tribal demands, and in this case, to give Meskwaki workers the control over their wages that they demanded. But perhaps the most significant point of contention between tribal members and the Indian Division administrators, and certainly the one with the greatest impact over the long term, involved the removal of Fred Anderson, a forester who was assigned by the BIA to oversee much of the settlement work. Anderson's story is an interesting case of Meskwaki tribal members flexing those sovereign muscles within the CCC-ID administrative system. But unfortunately, I don't have any excellent photographs to illustrate this particular anecdote, so instead I'll leave up this picture as I talk here, which is the only known image of the Meskwaki CCC-ID work group. I think it's the only known one, certainly the only one that I know of, and it was taken, I think, in the early 1930s. But anyway, Fred Anderson, that forester, had originally been stationed at a BIA central office in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but arrived at the settlement in early 1934. By 1935, two members of the self-appointed tribal council met with the BIA superintendent, Ira D. Nelson, to discuss Anderson's position in an altercation that had occurred between he and a tribal member. And the precise details of this particular incident remain murky, but it is clear that Frank Mitchell, Meskwaki, engaged Anderson in a heated exchange. The disagreement between the two men was severe enough for Nelson to suspend all of the relief work until the tribal council would guarantee no more disturbances from Meskwaki workers. Nelson blamed this disruption on two causes. First, he suspected that tribal members were jealous of others over the pay that two Meskwaki men received in their capacities as project foremen. These men received significantly higher pay than the average workers, earning $45 and $36 per month respectively, in basically a management role over the other workers out in the field during the day. And Nelson also suspected that the political vitriol over the pending IRA election had spilled over into the CCC-ID work, as both of the foremen were politically opposed to members of the self-appointed tribal council. And when a group of tribal members requested that Anderson and his Meskwaki foremen be relieved of their duties, Nelson assumed that they were motivated by either financial or political greed. And the full details of this incident are lost to history. It's possible, as Nelson suggested, that some level of personal or pecuniary rivalry drove this removal petition. But its authors, however, and this is very important, cited Anderson's failure to cooperate with the acting tribal council as the chief cause of their discontent, revealing that they viewed some of his managerial decisions as encroachments into tribal matters. Nelson defended Anderson to the BIA, and he continued to maintain that as forester, Anderson had made every effort to consider the council's input when making its decisions. I feel, Nelson wrote to John Collier, that this petition has been fostered by those who are jealous of the sub-foreman and the assistant leaders. But their motivations aside, the fact remains that the acting council and their fellow petitioners held sufficient influence within the BIA and the CCC-ID's administrative system as to effect an immediate resolution. To get relief work up and running, the council members agreed to hold a public meeting to discuss the issue and to discourage further disruptions. Nelson initially refused to make personnel changes on demand and continued defending Anderson to the BIA administrators in Washington, D.C., and he also continued to blame the situation on political rivalries. Nonetheless, in the end, the Meskwakis won out and Anderson was transferred to North Dakota the following month. That's right. Good for them. But Anderson's removal from the settlement may have been a victory for Meskwaki local control in the short term, but its consequences resounded for the duration of the tribe's Indian Division projects. After he left, Anderson that is, the Meskwaki CCC-ID program did not receive another forester for 6 whole years. I'm not sure if this was in retaliation or if it was just the product of some broader administrative stuff that I'll mention here. Instead, a BIA employee based out of Minnesota oversaw the projects from a distance. He and other officials made occasional visits to the settlement to review progress and to direct operations. And combined with budget cuts that hampered the CCC-ID programs nationwide in 1937, the lack of an on-site forester made it difficult to develop and administer new projects. So like I mentioned, I'm not sure if them not receiving another forester was some sort of retaliation or just the general downturn away from the CCC generally that occurred at the end of the 1930s. But overall, this resulted in a severe curtailment of the amount of work that was available to Meskwaki residents. With no one capable of preparing the projects, wrote one BIA official, projects were staffed on a case-by-case basis through the end of the 1930s. They were canceled entirely for half of 1941 because the district office in Minnesota had been unable to supply foremen to supervise the work on projects which had already been approved. And adding to this hardship, the scale-back canceled subsistence payments that were made to workers altogether, and it also cut the monthly salaries for all CCC-ID workers to $15 a month in early 1939. And by the time the BIA hired a new junior engineer to oversee the CCC-ID work in 1941, the Meskwaki tribe had undergone 7 long years of increasingly sporadic work relief. Unemployment rate remained a challenge, and the demand for work was so high that BIA administrators began rotating work schedules and various relief programs to spread wages as evenly as possible across the tribal population. And though CCC-ID projects continued through this later period, their infrequency had a negative impact on the struggling tribal economy. And this reality underscores an important lesson of the CCC-ID experience. Even as the CCC-ID programs offered increased local control to the tribe, consequences born from their decision to remove Anderson reverberated through some of the most burdensome years of the Great Depression. And on May 16, 1941, several Meskwaki elders laid the cornerstone for the new stone house that would be built along Highway 30. The day's celebrations included a parade through the towns of Tama and Toledo, as well as a feed and ceremony at the project site, music performed by tribal members, and a small powwow. The picture on the left, I'm sure you guys can't see it all that well up close, but it's actually a program that I found in the National Archives from the event that not only lists who was going to speak and sort of the order that the ceremonies would take place, but there's handwritten notes from a Meskwaki attendee sort of writing what was actually going on and how they switched some people around and stuff like that. But anyway, planning for the Stonehouse project began the previous fall as tribal members had envisioned a more permanent facility for the sale of their wares to passing tourists along the busy Highway 30. This plan included the development of a residential park replete with the Stonehouse, a well for drinking water, which I showed the well house for, as well as a parking lot. And such a large project would boost the number of needed workers from 10 to 35 and bring enrollment to levels not seen for months. The image up on the right here is one of the only pictures that we have of that residential park, and you can see the Stonehouse back in the upper left corner there, but basically little shelters, a parking lot, and these tables is where the tribal members would sell things that they made to passing tourists. And originally, the project had been slated for completion by the midsummer of 1941, but rainy weather and a lack of skilled stonemasons, as well as the need for laborers to tend to their personal crops, delayed the project's completion until the following spring. But even before that time, and indeed even before the United States had entered World War II, program administrators foresaw the closing of Indian Division operations. Many Meskwaki men and women enlisted in the war effort, and as the war ramped up, CCC programs across the nation wound down. and operations ceased on the Meskwaki settlement in July of 1942. But the stone house itself endures as the literal and figurative capstone of the Indian Division projects on the settlement. Over 70 years have passed since tribal members laid that cornerstone, and like the memory of the CCC-ID itself, much of the structure has since been obstructed from sight. Over the generations, as current Meskwaki Economic Development Director Larry Lasley writes, from trading post to community center to recreational building to boxing gym, the stone house did it all for about 50 years before it was recently abandoned just a couple of years ago. Today, there's some talk of replacing the stone house on the National Register of Historic Places or of finding a new use for the building. But whether functional or interpretive, a rehabilitated stone house would stand as a monument to a transformative era for the Meskwaki Nation. One coalition of scholars recently wrote that for Native American cultures, land is a hallmark of identity, a barometer of community integrity, and a resource for ongoing cultural and socioeconomic recovery. The Meskwaki settlement was all of these things during the New Deal, and improving it through CCC-ID programs became a way to tap into each of these notions at once. And the experience of the Meskwaki CCC-ID work group illuminates a few of the ways in which a small American Indian tribe melded their appreciation for their land with the drive to reaffirm their control over local affairs within the rapidly changing policies of the Indian New Deal. Historians, as I mentioned, have struggled for several decades to accurately describe the relationship between Native Americans and their environments. Interpretations have ranged from a close, fundamental connection with nature itself to a belief that Indian environmentalism is just rooted in myth. The Meskwaki Nation's experience reveals a blend of appreciation and pragmatism for the homeland that they remade in and after 1857. But moreover, it shows how tribal members combined a very real knowledge of their functional environment, as historian David Rich Lewis has put it, with a series of opportunities to improve their resources and to bolster their sovereignty. The CCC-ID might have started as an economic relief measure, and ultimately it did provide short-term employment for 112 Meskwaki tribal members. But when laid over the broader political changes of the 1930s, the program becomes a prism for understanding how a people's relationship to their land played out in practical and very meaningful ways. Not only were Meskwakis engaged in a process of environmental shaping from which their lives were reshaped, but instead they made deliberate decisions to improve their land in particular ways and to use the process of that development to improve their political position vis-a-vis the federal government. It was, after all, their resources and their future that were at stake. Or, put more simply by one tribal member to a BIA official in 1935, we own our own property and we got our own resources and our money is invested in our own land. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for a really interesting and informative paper. I have a two-part question that may address a broader issue than you would expect or like to address. But I noticed that you used both Native Americans and American Indians and apparently used the terms interchangeably. I know that a lot of university programs are still called Native American Studies, but scholars are increasingly going back to using the terms American Indian, but the popular understanding, I think, is that American Indian is somehow politically incorrect. So I'd just like you to address that terminology and where the status of that is right now. The second related one is that you were unmistakable in always calling the tribe Meskwaki. The cornerstone of the stone house says Sac and Fox. So that's obviously terminology that's changed over time too, and I wonder if you can address that language issue as well.
Yeah, sure. I have a question for you briefly before I respond to that. You work here and you have to sit like in the fifth row. What's the deal, Marv? No. There's an excellent question. Maybe I should have addressed it at the outset, but it's a very controversial and sort of contentious issue that pops up all the time. There's about half a dozen different accepted ways of referring to indigenous peoples depending on what their preference is. Of course, the thing that you always want to do, at least in my experience, is to try to be as accurate as you can with referring to a very specific tribe by the name that it prefers to go by. Jonathan and other tribal members have told me that Meskwaki, and specifically this particular spelling of the word, is what they have preferred. But outside of that, there's Native American, American Indian, Indigenous, First Nations, Aboriginal, all of these different terms, and basically every book that you encounter has a little part at the beginning that explains, I know there's a big controversy about this, but I'm just trying to use them, in ways that are most respectful. The thing that I learned living back home in South Dakota, where the term Indian itself, where in some contexts is considered a little derogatory, is used very frequently in and around those communities. I've heard people sort of mention it out on the settlement. So I think that it's important to try to lay this all out in a way that does respect to precisely talking about which historical groups, and in this case the Meskwaki, are doing what. But when you're trying to talk about broader issues, knowing that all of those different words are sort of loaded in their own way, that you just sort of move ahead, and if anybody's ever offended by it or anything like that, you try to address it and apologize and adjust accordingly. But generally speaking, I think the way that I've done it is sort of a convention among historians to just, like I said, be precise when you're talking about one tribal group, and then to use Native American and American Indian somewhat interchangeably in the writing. So, and I've rarely, other than in very official publications or things, do you see the tribe refer to itself as Sac and Fox, Tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa, partly because that's kind of a mouthful, but also because it was ascribed to the tribe by the federal government. So I think Meskwaki is the term that's used most frequently. No problem.
Anyone else have a question for Eric? I'd just like to comment that the continuation of this story is, I believe it's either 22 or 27, I've forgotten, of these CCC workers from the Indian Division did enlist in the Army, in the Iowa National Guard in February 1941, and 8 of them were selected to be trained as code talkers. And I really appreciate Eric's legwork and time that he spent digging out this evidence and telling us a story that we don't know, the tribe doesn't know very well. It's really been forgotten and been obscured. So again, let's give Eric a big round of applause.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.